The Capital Weekly podcast is a production of Open California and is sponsored by TASIN, the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations.
Greetings and welcome to the Capital Weekly podcast. I'm John Howard, and I am joined by my colleague, as usual, Tim Foster.
Hi, John.
And our special guest today is Mark DiCamillo, veteran pollster, premier pollster of the state. I'm trying to embarrass him. Mark, thank you very much for being with us today. We wanted to chat about your latest poll at Berkeley IGS.
Great. I'm happy to be here.
Obviously, one of the big messages of the poll is that people who are likely to vote, it's closer now between those who want to dump Newsom and those that support him. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for it. Certainly in our earlier poll in April, we did suggest that there was an interest gap, that Republican voters reported being much more likely to be highly interested in voting in the recall election. We documented that again in this poll, but we found some other factors as well. We asked a question about who voters thought was going to win. What was the outcome of the recall going to be? Would Newsom be able to defeat it, or would he be recalled? And nearly all Democrats said, oh, no, he's going to defeat it. It was something like 80% to 7 or 8%. I mean, it was so all one-sided, whereas Republicans were more likely to say, no, he's going to be recalled by about a 2-to-1 margin. So there's a fair amount of complacency, I would think, built into those numbers. Democrats just think this is not that serious, I think, and yet the poll shows otherwise. I would also point to the fact that the replacement election doesn't seem to be arousing much attention or interest among Democrats. Certainly there's no major Democrat in the field. And when we asked the preference question listing all the various candidates on the replacement election, a quarter of the Democrats say, I'm not even going to be voting in that election, which is an odd thing, given that when you count the votes, it'll likely be more Republicans voting than Democrats, and it gives Republicans another reason to show up at the polls. So, it's a very odd situation. It's certainly a surprise to us, because when you looked at the overall registered voters, which we asked, how would you vote if you were voting? So if everyone had voted, we didn't see any erosion in Newsom's recall numbers from our April poll. So the news story here was that once you define likely voters, based on their interest, based on their stated intention to vote, and also based on their voting history, it's much closer. And that is a worrisome thing for the governor.
So you've been talking about the Republican and the Democratic base. Where do the independents fall out in there?
The independents, like they usually are, usually reflect the broader statewide electorate. I mean, I've always thought that no party preference voters really show you which way the wind is blowing in politics on most issues. And so when you look at the preferences of no party preference voters who are likely to vote, it's 4 points. 50% would support retaining the governor, 46% would vote for the recall. So it's very similar to the statewide numbers, which are 50-47.
What's with the popularity of Los Angeles area talk show hosts? I remember in the 90s, Bruce Urshenson, who got cocked up as being this really strong candidate that many people in the state had never heard of. I think Larry Elder is sort of in that position as a talk show host in LA, but outside of LA, I have to tell you the truth, I like politics and follow it. I'd never heard of him until 4 or 5 days ago, if that. So is this basically LA weighted? Is this LA heavy?
No. LA is actually much smaller share of the likely voter population than what their total registered voter numbers would be. Only about 21% of the likely voters are coming from LA County. It's about equal to the Bay Area, which you often see in low turnout elections. You see the Bay Area voters comprising just as many or sometimes more of the electorate than LA. So no, it's not a LA centric thing. I think also Larry Elder was going through this week when we were doing the polling of suing the Secretary of State, making a lot of noise and a lot of press about the fact that he was left off the ballot, and yet he had turned in something like 300 pages of tax returns, and he ultimately won a judgment by in court to put his name on the ballot. So I think that, ironically, his omission by the Secretary of State ironically benefited him in getting more people aware of who he was. And, you know, when you look at our numbers, we had this question, which I found very interesting, you know, where we asked about each of the major candidates, at least the ones who were being most talked about in the replacement election. Would you be considering or not considering supporting this candidate? And they could mention as many names as they wanted to as candidates they would consider. Larry Elder is being considered by 78% of the Republican voters in our sample. That compares to 56% for Cox, 52% for Falconer, and then it drops off after those three. So of the Republican voters, they seem to have more recognition and knowledge, or at least say they're considering Elder than any of the others, which is a very surprising result for someone like us up here in Northern California. And I'm in the Bay Area, you're in Sacramento. So, it's not heavily coming from that, but these are Republicans around the state.
Well, and I think one of the other surprising things there is you said that Cox was actually doing better than Falconer. And I think many had argued that Falconer was really the star who had yet to emerge. And so far, he is not emerging, or at least that's my take on these numbers.
Yeah, his campaign, I think, mostly is policy oriented. It's heavy on policy. He wants to present himself as the serious candidate in the bunch. I've been polling a long time. Policy isn't always the biggest deal for voters. I mean, the specifics of the policies that you're going to implement, I mean, it's really a lot about do voters feel warm and comfortable with you? I mean, really, it's like Mervyn Field used to say, it's like trying on a suit. You have to feel comfortable. You try it on and you say, yeah, that feels pretty good. I don't think he's made the sale on that dimension yet. For some reason, Larry Elder feels like a very comfortable suit for a lot of Republican voters.
Is the takeaway here for Democrats that they have to get the vote out? They've got to energize their base. They've got to get their message out, whereas before they don't seem to have done that very well. Is that fair to say?
Most clearly. Again, if everyone voted, the overall electorate, Newsom was 15 points, defeating the recall by 15 points in the same poll. So, all you have to do is look at those two sets of numbers. About half of the people were considered the most likely to vote, and the rest of them, it was nearly 6,000 people in our sample. The total were the total registered voters. You had a 15-point gap among the total registered voters, just a 3-point gap among likely voters. So those other 3,000 people in our sample, certainly if they were voting, were heavily weighted toward Newsom, but they're at the moment in time, they're not voting.
The way the election's set up, it's a two-step ballot, two-point ballot. You are asked whether you want to get rid of Newsom or not. And then you're asked, who would you replace him with? So I was looking at the 2003, Schwarzenegger, who was a late entry into the election, wound up getting less than half the vote. He got 48.5%, I think.
Right.
He got less than a majority and won the governorship because on question 2, you just have to have more than whoever is close to you. If you have the most votes, you win. So does this hurt Newsom, hurt an incumbent going into the election, or does it make much difference, or can you tell?
Well, it depends on the enthusiasm on the replacement side. And we still don't know yet how enthusiastic voters are going to be towards the various Republicans. And again, looking at the sample, it looks like Republicans will be making the decisions because many of the Democrats are going to be sitting on their hands. So I continue to look at the Republicans, and in the coming weeks, look at the campaign contributions. Look at, I read this morning that Elder was endorsed by the Lincoln Club in Orange County. That's a significant thing. If he can coalesce support around his candidacy, I mean, he wants to just make it me versus Newsom. He wants that to be the frame for Republican voters anyways, when they go to the polls. And we'll have to see if that's a successful strategy. But it's real. A lot depends on just the enthusiasm that Republicans have for a candidate. I mean, right up to the entry of Elder, you'd have to say that most of the Republicans were just kind of wondering, who's there and who should I support, and they hadn't yet felt all that comfortable. Now we do have a front runner, even though 40% of voters are undecided. Elder is the front runner. It's clear in this poll, both on the consideration measure and on the first choice preference measure, where he's leading 18% to 10% for Falconer and Cox.
But to be clear, this is still an early point in this race, in a sense. I mean, because they had just declared, because he got all that free press about the lawsuit. This could really change. We're at a fungible point, and we still have a month and a half until the actual election. Is there a reason to think that this could significantly change in the next 90 days? I mean, or not 90 days, 45 days?
Well, it's a very compressed timetable. Voters are going to be getting their ballots in a few weeks. So, things will have to happen very quickly to really alter the dynamic that you're starting to see. I wish we had more polls and more time to do trend measures among the likely voters. I mean, this was the first poll we took in which we tried to define likely voters in a way that we felt comfortable with, because at least voters knew when the election was. It's coming up on September 14th. And, we could talk about that date and how likely they would be to vote on that date, how much interest they have in the election, and so on. But because it's so compressed, we'll only be doing one more poll, and that'll be in the final week before the election. And at that time, we'll probably see that a big chunk of the vote has already been cast, which for a pre-election poll is a good thing because they are the likeliest of likely voters. If they've already voted, and we usually go back to the Secretary of State and to check the verification that they actually submitted the ballot, we don't just take their word for it. We can then look at that vote and see how it's going. And, political data always publishes this interesting information about who the composition of the electorate of people who've already voted. I'm hoping that they do that again, Paul Mitchell's group. That's very helpful as well. So we'll have a lot more information when we're doing our final poll about the turnout than we do now. Right now, it is our best guess. But again, these are the likeliest of likely voters in our sample. I have to say that.
Well, and one question I have, so in 2020, because of the pandemic, every voter was mailed a ballot. Is that correct?
Right. And we're going to get that again for this election.
Exactly. And so do you think that could change the picture of who really is a likely voter, or is that something you took into account in doing this?
No, we didn't take it into account because it hadn't happened yet. It's all very, if people had received a ballot, we could have certainly said, have you received a ballot? Do you recognize the fact that you have it in your possession? Have you not thrown it away into the trash can? Again, we're measuring interest and intention, and these are directly from the respondent. And the Democrats were 30, 40 points lower on both of those measures than the Republicans. So, maybe once the ballot is in hand, it'll shake things up, but I can't look around the corner on this poll. I can look I can take another snapshot when we do our next poll and see what it says at that time. And again, if the shape of the turnout is significantly different, that will be a major storyline from our next poll. It's going to be as much about who's ahead, but also who's seems like they're likely to vote, or who are voting in this election.
Mark, in your polling, do you inquire where the people you're surveying, where they get their information about the candidates? Is it newspapers, TV, social media, that kind of thing?
We actually do. We have a question in there, and we didn't really report on it, but I can try to look it up while I'm on the call. But we had a question in the survey which asked voters where they get most of their information about politics. And let me just kind of review for a minute what
they didn't also Capital Weekly, I take it.
I'm sorry?
They didn't say Capital Weekly was where they got their.
No, these were very broad categories like television and, social media, that kind of thing.
They didn't just volunteer. I read Capital Weekly every.
No. We didn't ask it that way. We had about 10 categories of.
Well, next time. Next time
I'll do that for you guys. Okay. But anyways, I'm trying to see if I can find that tabulation because it is in our data, but I'm not seeing it at the moment. So I'm sorry.
Well, the only reason I ask that is because sort of a cliche in campaigning is that you try to define your opponent before your opponent defines you.
Right.
And I'm wondering if Larry Elder kind of springs up, at the last minute now.
Yeah.
Whether now all the Democratic strategists are after this guy with all the Oppo research they've got and whatever.
Yeah. All right, I just found it. So let me break some poll number news for you guys on this podcast. About 40% of the voters said they got their main political news from news websites. So they go online and they go to websites of various news organizations or secondary sources or whatever. And among those voters, the no voters were 10 points greater than the yes voters on the recall. So a little more heavily weighted for Newsom on that particular segment. Next, the largest segment were people who got their information from television, whether it's network TV or local TV. It was just a broad category. Similar numbers, 10 points on the no side for the recall. But if you got your news from social media, it was an 8-point advantage on the yes side. That was only about 10% of the sample, but it does show that different news sources really make a difference. If you're following social media for your main political news, you're more likely to be on the yes side in this recall.
Does the fact that mail-in voting will begin before 29 days out, I think, from the election, from September 14th. So you're going to have to be polling then. You'll be out in the field when people have already mailed in their ballots. How do you accommodate for that? People already voted.
We've done this many times where, a big slug of the vote, maybe a quarter of the sample of people that you're reaching in your final poll, say they've already voted. It's a direct question. How likely are you to vote in the recall election? And the fourth category, or have you already voted? And so, very likely, somewhat likely, or whatever. Among those who have already voted, we basically ask them the question in the past tense. Here is the ballot. For whom did you vote? For those who haven't voted yet, we say, who are you likely to vote if you're voting today? So, we have this sample and it's substantial. I'm expecting in our final poll, at least I'm hoping, that we'll get 4,000 or 5,000 likely voters. We're going to send out emails to even more voters than we did on this poll. And so if a quarter of them have already voted, you might have as many as 1,000 people in our sample who've already voted, which would be a pretty stable estimate. So we'll have that information. It does make me a little more secure when I'm releasing my final pre-election poll, because at least I've got a quarter of the vote pretty much well documented. And so then the rest of it is the intentions of the remaining voters. So if the early voters, here's a good litmus test. If the early voters are favoring Newsom, I think that's probably a very good sign, because I think the Republicans are so enthusiastic and so interested in this race that they'll probably vote as soon as they can. They'll be the earliest of the early voters. So if Newsom is surviving among the early people who've already voted, I think he's probably going to be on safe ground with the rest of the sample, although I'm just making assumptions here. So that's how I'll be looking at our final poll.
Do you run into a problem where people don't want to be surveyed?
Oh, God, of course. It's the major problem of the polling industry. And, it's the major dilemma. And every pollster is trying to confront that differently. The way in which we're doing it at Berkeley, and I think this is a fairly good way of going about it. We have a very large sample because we're actually sending out email invitations from the university to a random sample of the state's registered voters. We do benefit from the fact that about 10 million Californians have an email address affixed to their registered voter, their official registered voter file. So we can randomly sample voters off of that 10 million sample. Certainly, we make some adjustments for the people who are not with email addresses. But we have such a large sample of votes coming back, or of respondents coming back, we then can actually model the electorate. And that's the real key to our poll. Random sampling is great. I've always been a big fan of random sampling. It's better than panels where you recruit people. But the best thing about our poll, I think, is the amount of weighting and modeling that we overlay onto the responses that we get. We certainly know, for example, that people who are active voters are more likely to participate in a poll because they seem to participate in elections. Well, they're also more likely to participate in polls. So you have to, when the overall sample comes back, the people who didn't vote in recent elections needs to be modeled or weighted up because you're underrepresenting them somewhat. The same kind of thing is going on, and we saw this in the last two presidential elections, nationwide and in California. The same thing is going on among voters who supported Donald Trump for president. Fewer of them, for whatever reasons, chose to participate in polls. And I think that was one of the weaknesses of the national polls and even within the various competitive states. It was a lot closer because of response rates were lower among the Trump supporters than among the Biden supporters. Same thing happened in the Clinton Trump election. So we can also model that to the actual vote, not only statewide, but within all of these separate little regions of the state. We divide the state into 8 or 9 different regions. We have the actual vote from the 2020 presidential election. We make sure that our sample of the people who voted in that election line up properly in how they voted. So we're doing a lot of things. And then we have the traditional ways of modeling, which is get the right number of Republicans and Democrats, get the right number of men and women, get the regions right in terms of the population totals. There's so much that we're doing in modeling the electorate that it gives me comfort that I think our poll at the end of the line, the weighted sample, is as good an estimate as you can get in today's age of hard to reach voters. It's a tall order, but because we're starting out hopefully with 8,000 or so registered voters, we've got a lot of sample there. We've got a lot of groups that can be weighted. The less educated voters need to be weighted up more than the higher educated voters. There's a lot of things going on all at the same time. And we're trying to do as best we can to represent what we think is the state of California in all of its various characteristics.
Mark, when you talk about a likely voter, is that someone who voted in the last election or the last 2 elections or the last 3? How do you what is a likely voter? And we know what a registered voter is and an eligible voter is.
Right. It's a judgment call. We have 3 different variables that went into the definition of likely voters in this poll. The questions the first one was about interest. How interested are they in voting in this upcoming election? And then there was a direct question about stated intentions. Are you absolutely certain you're going to vote, somewhat certain or whatever? There was a scaled response there. And then we also have the voting file, so we know whether or not the voter has voted in past elections. Now, in the 2020 election, for example, the presidential election, 80% of California's registered voters voted. I mean, this was the biggest turnout we'd seen in many, many years. So we want evidence, I think, in this poll of the fact that at least they participated in one of the past elections. I mean, if 80% voted in the presidential, they'll get through the screen if they just said that. But I mean, if they happen not to have voted in 2020, we'll look back at 2018 and other elections. We want to see some evidence that they voted, that they're living and breathing and actually voted. So that's part of it in this sample.
You know, special elections always have, in California, traditionally have had low turnout.
Right.
And we've had special elections on a myriad of things, earthquake repairs and funding and that kind of stuff, taxes, that. But this is also a special election. But do you get a sense of more people are interested in it or not? Do you get a turnout? I know it's a hard question to answer.
It's a hard thing. And even with our, rigorous turnouts questioning, about half of the people got through the screen. I think it was like 48 or 49% ended up in that sample, the pool of voters that we considered likely to vote. Now, some reporters would then say, oh, you're predicting a 48% turnout. No, not really. I don't know what the turnout will be. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can say that these are the likeliest of likely voters. And even if it's an over-reportage, let's say it's only going to be a 40% turnout, it's not that uncommon for people to overstate their intentions. They'd like to vote, they intend to vote, but they don't always vote. I guess I'm expecting turnout to be in the, less than half, but I couldn't tell you exactly where it'll be. It would surprise me if it were a big turnout election.
Mark, one last question. Do you see any trends? Do you see anything? I know the polling has been completed, but are you seeing anything now that we can look ahead over the next 2 or 3 weeks that you expect to happen or may happen? The numbers telling you anything?
No, but, just looking at this result from this snapshot, I mean, I wish I had multiple snapshots, then I can see a moving target. But just the numbers that jumped out at me, besides the fact that it was a close election among the likely electorate, were the Larry Elder numbers. Let's follow him in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I want to look at other polls that come out to show his support. I want to look at other indicators besides polls, campaign contributions, endorsements, whatever you have at your disposal. Let's see, is this really a consensus candidate, or is it just something that happened in this poll because of the week in which we were doing it? He was making a lot of news because he was suing the state and actually winning. And that roused the Republican electorate. So let's see if Falconer makes a move. I know there's going to be some debates. Maybe the Republican base will warm up to one of the candidates in the debates. I don't think Elder is going to be a part of that debate, the first one anyways. So it'll give an opportunity for Falconer and Cox and some of the other Republicans to make their case and to get people aroused and interested. There's still a huge chunk of voters who haven't made up their minds.
Marty Camillo, thank you so much. We could chat for another hour on politics and polling. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now we are going to head to a sort of a regular feature we do. Who had the worst week in California politics?
The worst week. Worst week. Worst week.
Tim Foster, it seems like when we were chatting about this earlier, it seems like Gavin Newsom had a bad week in California politics, partly because of Mark's polling, the numbers that evolved from the surveying. So what do you think?
I think that's the best I've seen. I think there was a lot of shock in these numbers, especially considering that the last polling that had come out that Mark alluded to, the no on the recall side seemed to have been much higher, and it seems to have declined. Also, I think combined with that, not related to the polling, I think the fact that the Delta variant really seems to be becoming a very aggressive part of our lives again, and we're having mask mandates in some locations. I don't think that's going to be good for the governor. And then, of course, there was, I'm not really even clear on the news here, but there was a photo of one of his kids taken without a mask at a daycare or a school or something. I'm not even that clear on it, but he was getting pinged for that. And of course, it's never good when your kid is being singled out. I think most people agree that politicians' children should be left alone, but some people don't follow that. So it has not been the greatest week. I'm sure Gavin Newsom has had better weeks, put it that way.
I think the numbers too would suggest that he repositioned some of his campaign strategy, at least to the extent I've seen it, that really it's coming down to a get out the vote and getting Democrats energized. I guess it's no surprise that the people who want the recall are more energized and engaged than those that don't. But I think those that don't should get more on the ball here, it seems to me, politically. And I think the numbers basically reflect that. So I think it's fair to say the governor had a bad week. He's an easy punching bag, I know, but this week it seemed to work. So there you are. Anyway, Tim, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, John.
And this is John Howard saying we will see you next time around. Take care.
The Capital Weekly podcast is produced by Tim Foster for Open California. If you enjoyed today's episode, we hope you'll go onto iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a positive review. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.